All right, here we go. This is Kinesiology 223. This is Chapter 5, Presentation 4. And in this part of the chapter, the authors are attempting to connect arousal and anxiety to performance, and to do so, they present several different models and theories to make their argument, if you will. I like some of these. Some of these I think they're okay in describing the process, but I'm not trying to bury you in details on all these. I'm basically just trying to pull information, or I'm sorry, pull these out of the book and then provide maybe 4 bullet points, things that you can have as like takeaways regarding these different theories going forward. So let's go ahead and jump in. I look at the drive theory. Drive theory is something we're already familiar with from earlier in the class, because we talked about the process. Drive theory presents that an athlete will perform better as their psychological arousal increases when the task is familiar. Now, this brings us back to the example of the students who were asked to perform a task in front of an audience, and the students who did better were skilled in performing a task. So in that example, they're presented with a challenge, they're presented with a task, and because they were able to and familiar with and skilled in the task, they were then able to perform it. And as the psychological arousal increased, so too did their performance. Now, beginners and novices will have a different experience with this, because as the pressure goes up, meaning psychological arousal, there will be a point where you'll have a negative effect. So you have a positive correlation with people who are familiar with the task, skilled with the task. You have a negative correlation with people who are beginners and novices who might not be familiar or skilled with the task. I like this inverted U hypothesis. It holds that low levels and high levels are too little or too much. You need kind of a Goldilocks amount of arousal to be able to get the response that you want. And athletes will perform best at this moderate amount and operating within a certain range. Now, the goal is to not be too overly anxious, nor be too understimulated to get the response. And the way they describe it or present it is this: that you have this optimal level of arousal in here, where when you have physiological arousal itself, you have too low, you're going to have low performance. If you have too high physiological arousal, you'll have low performance. But in this kind of Goldilocks sweet spot up here, if you have just the right amount of physiological arousal, you'll get the optimal level of performance. And that's kind of the sweet spot you're looking for as a coach. So with the IZOF, I'm sorry I cut off the I, the Z, and the O, and I just left you functioning. But the IZOF model suggests that each athlete has a unique range of emotional and arousal states where they perform their best. And it's unique to the person, it's unique to the skill at hand, it's unique to their experience with the skill, and quite frankly, how skilled they are at the skill or the task. And it's going to vary based upon any number of environmental factors. Could be what sport it is, what event, what position they're playing, who's their opponent, what's the actual environment they're participating in. And what's important to note here is that the IZOF takes into account both negative and positive emotions. Now, the way they lay this out in the book is like this. You have 3 different athletes, and within these athletes, it's not saying one is better than the other, good, better, best, but you have to understand that, like athlete A, they have their best performance if they're in a low state anxiety level, whereas athlete C has their best performance if they're in a high state anxiety level. And B is kind of like in a Goldilocks, where they're right in the middle of those two. But what ends up happening is you have a team of people, and you'll have some people who will be athlete A, some will be athlete B, and some will be athlete C. And as a coach, you have to be able to pick out which of your players work best together in this type of model, and actually with some of these other models as well. The big thing you're looking at this, though, this is not to say that somebody's a great practice player and they're terrible in a game, or they're a horrible practice player and they're a gamer. No, this is just stating that you have different athletes who are made up differently, who will have different state anxiety levels, and one athlete might function best in a low state anxiety level, whereas another person might function best in a high state anxiety level. Got it? Good. All right. Multidimensional anxiety theory. It really takes into account the amount of worry, right? So cognitive, that's your thoughts. Somatic, that's your body. And it takes into consideration that, cognitive state anxiety and somatic state anxiety, and how they relate to each other, and how if you're thinking poor thoughts and you are not, or you're doing negative self-talk, it can have a negative effect on the somatic state anxiety, meaning as you are thinking negative thoughts, you end up having poor performance. Poor performance propagates or causes you to have more negative thoughts, and more negative thoughts cause you to have worse performance, right? So it ends up being like this cycle where you're just going down and down and down. And as a coach, so you have to be able to pick out your athletes or pick which athletes have these types of issues and be able to understand this. Now there is a bit of an inverted U relationship between this, right? Because you have this anxiety, and as the anxiety goes up, you're going to get a performance response, absolutely. But if the anxiety becomes too great, you'll actually have a reduction in performance. And so this is very much like the inverted U theory, but it takes into account the cognitive state anxiety and somatic state anxiety that you see. There is a point with every one of these models where too much is too much. And you have to see this as a coach and understand when your athletes are overstressed. And you get into catastrophe phenomenon where if you look at both of those inverted U examples, performance will increase, and there's a relation between the physiological arousal and cognitive anxiety. There is an increase and there's a performance that's a positive slope. But when the arousal becomes too high, you have this catastrophic event and performance just falls off the table. If you think to the movie Tin Cup, for example, where he was playing a round of golf and he's on the course and he hits one into the water and he's like, give me the ball, puts the ball down, hits the next one in the water, give me a ball, puts it down, hits the next one into the water over and over and over again. In essence, he was going through what the process of catastrophe phenomena is. He was having a golf round where he was performing, and then with one mistake it became a second mistake, and a second mistake became a third mistake, and it just spiraled and became this giant balloon of errors, and he ended up not doing well in the tournament. But what you have to have is, with this especially, but with the other models, if you can have it in place where you can teach your athletes different ways to manage this, through positive mental prep on the front end, positive self-talk as you're preparing, as well as in the actual event itself. Relaxation techniques, good situational awareness, good basically understanding of self to know when you're going down the path of maybe catastrophe or inverted U and you're a little bit overstimulated. These are things you can do to help prepare your athletes to have a better understanding and greater self-awareness, as well as situational awareness, to know when they might be going down a path of ruin. With reversal theory, it definitely depends upon how the person interprets their arousal levels. And athletes can fluctuate back and forth, right? And they can fluctuate back and forth from day to day and play to play, as I mentioned earlier. And you'll have situations where as the person is participating in an activity, they have their own interpretation of the arousal, not just the amount that's given to them, but it's how they interpret it. And that's different than having this broad-based, everybody has the same stress being presented to them, because everybody can have the same stress, but how we process it is different, and then how we interpret that stress is different. We've talked about that already. Now, people who can shift and reverse their positive and negative interpretations from moment to moment, in some regards, are a little bit more of an advantage, right? Because you go to make a play, you miss the play, you make a mistake, you got to be able to get up, shift out of your negative thought process. That's what I did wrong. Here's what I need to do next time it comes up, and then you move on to the next play. So you have this ability, at least with reversal theory, to be able to have a bad play, understand it, process it, be able to learn from it, and it doesn't become an angst-ridden or anxiety-driven process. It ends up being almost like an educational and learning process from play to play and day to day, to be able to shift back and forth between good and bad. So it's very dynamic, very flexible. So with that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and break off from here, and then moving on to the next presentation. Thanks.